afternoon, America. Brian James Blem. I want to welcome you back to another episode of What the Fuck's Up. Today I want to talk about elections and structural changes that have been made to your election since the original election of Donald Trump in 2016. It's very important for you to understand the structural changes that have been made for you to understand where the election weaknesses are and where the election fraud is actually taking place. Because there is election fraud in counties like Maricopa County, Arizona. And so let's take a look at sort of what we used to do versus what we now do. 2016 and before, we held elections based on what's called the precinct model. And in the precinct model, each one of these little red geographical areas, these all have roughly the same population, but the population density differs. These are more rural, of course, these are more urban. And so each one of these boxes has roughly the same amount of people. And so on election day, what would you do? You would go, if you lived in Queen Creek in this little rectangle here, you would go to that little rectangle and you would show them your ID. They would give you a ballot if you were on the voter registration list, check your name off, and then you would vote. And they would stay afterwards when the elections or the polls closed, and they would tabulate all the ballots. They would count them all up to see what the results were in that little precinct, and then they would email or fax or whatever the results of all the elections in their little precinct to downtown Phoenix, where Maricopa County Elections Department headquarters is. And then Maricopa County Elections Headquarters would add all of these numbers up from each one of these different little precincts, and voila, poof, they would put out your election results, that night. So you had a pretty good idea of who won whatever races. This is the way our elections basically worked, 2016 and prior. These are a very decentralized system of elections, folks. Exceptionally decentralized. And one thing it's very difficult to do in a decentralized system, because there are so many players spread out over such a wide area, it's very, very difficult to induce any fraud into the system that's going to change the outcome of results on a system-wide basis. Yeah, maybe a small little area here you might be able to cheat enough to affect the results because there are so few people, relatively speaking. But systemic fraud in each one of these would be very, very, very near impossible to do. And so it makes it very impossible in statewide or countywide races to actually cheat enough to influence the outcome of a race. And so you remember when Donald Trump's elected in 2016, he beats Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton was the national security deep state hack. She loved to drone people, and she would let the national security state do whatever they wanted to do. Donald Trump had a completely different agenda, and that was to rein in the power of the national security state and move us from a constant perpetual war footing, which made a lot of people filthy, dirty, rich, to a peace footing. National security state didn't like that. They think they should have their way in defending America rather than you, the voters, defending America the way you think it should be defended. And so what happens? You get Susan Spalding, the Undersecretary of the National Security State, then you get John Jay, the Secretary of the National Security State, say, we're going to decree all election infrastructure critical national security infrastructure. What does that mean? That they can get their dirty claws into it and manipulate it and make changes to it. And that's exactly what begins happening after the election of Donald Trump. You get the creation of CISA, right? What's CISA do? It controls and regulates your speech. It controls and regulates your voting infrastructure, your machines, and all the other infrastructure related to your elections. And so they create this institution, CISA. Susan Spalding had already in 2016, 2017 primarily, sent her team out to study everything about US elections so they could learn about how US elections work and how purportedly to make them more democratic so that the proper candidates won. And so what do? You get companies like Runbeck Election Services, private for-profit companies. All they do are elections. So what do they become under John Jay and Susan Spalding? They become national security infrastructure that the national security state can get its talents into. Well, Runbeck, 2017, 2018 era, begins to lobby in Washington, D.C., of all places, for structural changes to the precinct model of voting. And what did they recommend? Well, they recommended what is known as the vote center model. So if this is still Maricopa County, each one of these squares now, instead of all of those many little red geographical areas, if you went to vote, you could go vote in any one of these. Right? If you lived up here, you can go vote down here. The problem with this type of system, folks, is it's more centralized. There are a lot more voters that can go to any one voting location to vote. So you have to become technologically dependent, right? You can't just go print off ballots for each one of these, because if the entire county voted here, there would no way be enough ballots for everybody. So what do? You create a system whereby ballots are printed and the voter registration database is online so that it can access everybody countywide. We know the voter registration databases are online now because they were hacked during the 2024 primary election in both Maricopa County and Pima County when they went down. Okay, that's a significant problem, folks. When your voter registration database goes down in the middle of an election, that's a huge issue that more people need to be talking about, but your media in Maricopa County and Arizona generally wants absolutely nothing to do with the issue. And so you go to a vote center now in Maricopa County to vote. And so Maricopa County, Scott Jarrett still doesn't know why. Maricopa County hired a former justice from the Arizona Supreme Court to study the reason why every now and then a printer during an election will send an off-size ballot to the printer that cannot be tabulated, and that results in long lines and people going home and basically disenfranchising what turn out to be Republican voters, because Republican voters primarily vote on election day as opposed to any other cohort of voters if you look at them statistically. And so how about this for a theory? We know the voter registration database has been online since this was implemented in 2018. How about somebody been hacking your system and attaching a tag to high propensity voters so that whenever they show up at a vote center to vote, it sends a command to do an off-size printed ballot. And then what the result of that is it won't tabulate, so you have to give the person a new ballot to vote because they don't want to put it in door 3. You give them a new ballot, and the same thing happens, and you start getting long lines. That's a problem, folks. It's called voter disenfranchisement through this technical manipulation that's happening in your elections. This system, though, as a result of COVID, accounts for a small percentage of Maricopa County voters. That's less than 20% of all Maricopa County voters will go and cast their ballot in a vote center. So you can manipulate vote centers to create long lines and thereby disenfranchise voters. And that affects a small amount, but you have a hugely centralized system for over 80% of Maricopa County voters. And what is that system? Well, 3 essential components to that system. Runbeck, of course, which lobbied for the implementation of this process in 2017 and 2018. We know it is national security critical infrastructure. The United States Postal Service, critical election infrastructure, folks, because with over 2 million ballots in Maricopa County being handled by the USPS, of course, you're going to want the national security state to play a role in that organization. But the problem with all this system, folks, here's the problem. You can't get records from Runbeck in Arizona because it's a private, for-profit corporation. You can't get records from the United States Postal Service. Why is that? Because an Inspector General report has just come out that is highly critical of the United States Postal Service, saying it doesn't do its job with election-related mail. They don't keep records regarding election-related mail, folks. They don't. We've done FOIA requests to the United States Postal Service, and their response is, oh, yeah, sorry, we don't have those records. Another part of the problem is Maricopa County Recorder has never maintained records they get from the Postal Service with each and every delivery of mail-in ballots during the election cycle. They throw them away, folks. They don't have them. They don't have them. Nobody can actually prove how many mail-in ballots have ever been delivered to Runbeck, because how hard would it be just to add an extra truckload from somewhere and boom, drop off Runbeck, said these are all U.S. Postal Service records, and you just have to take some guy's word for it. Okay, this is a huge problem, folks, because it's a very centralized system that you can't see into, and not to mention the fact that the USPS is very critical of itself. You always see, you know, the management of the USPS coming out and saying, don't send little Johnny $20 in the mail for Christmas, it's not likely to arrive. Why? Somebody in the US postal system is going to pilfer the 20 bucks. You see all the stories and reports about people, folks, working for the US Postal Service, opening mail, stealing credit cards, and going on shopping sprees. This is a huge problem. Don't deliver expensive presents to your kids via the US Postal Service, says the US Postal Service. Two questions arise from all of this is why we allow such an institution to exist in the first place is beyond me. But the second central question is, folks, why we allow them such a significant role in the most important things we do as American citizens, and that is vote, because they have a huge role. How hard would it be to find one of these yokels willing to jack little Johnny's 20 bucks and say, hey, yeah, because they've centralized their process, folks, within the Postal Service itself. Very few Postal Service employees play a role in this centralized process. And so how hard would it be to find somebody that says, okay, well, you put one undeliverable ballot in a bin for Maricopa County, which, by the way, never receives the actual undeliverable ballots back. And then you put these undeliverable ballots in a box for a non-governmental organization that will pick them up when you're on your lunch break. And then, what do you have? Unmanned drop boxes. So it's very easy to inject these ballots into the system. What they have created, folks, is a system. They've replaced a system very, very hard to engage in widespread fraud with a system that's very easy to engage in widespread fraud, folks. County Recorder, we can't even hardly get records from them anymore, right? Yeah, top secret stuff. Your elections have been buried in a big black box that you, the citizens of the state of Arizona, are not allowed to look into. They've been very heavily centralized since the original election of Donald Trump and since the national security state got involved in your election. And what is that involvement in your elections, folks? What's the tie that binds? The tie that binds each of these institutions together, folks, is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency created by Susan Spalding. Not only does she have your ass kicked off of Twitter and Facebook, but they have control of all of this, folks. And like I said in my last video, if you don't think people are willing to cheat to win elections, you're sleeping on the wrong planet. Just go back and look at Nixon and what G. Gordon Liddy was willing to do on his behalf. You see story after story after story after people wanting power so badly. They're willing to steal it, folks. They created a system that facilitates wide-scale, large fraud in your election systems to make it easier to manage and control the outcomes of those elections, because they want their agenda to prevail. And with that, I say peace.